Welcome to Small Talk, where each week we sit down to discuss the sermon-based small group questions at Wallula Christian Church.
Welcome to the Small Talk podcast. I'm Klayton, here with Lance and Craig, and so we just started this sermon series here at Wallula Christian Church, Prepare for Impact, where we're going through the book of Revelation, and so we just wanted to go through some of the small group questions and dig into what Lance said this Sunday and talk a little bit more about Revelation. So just in a few minutes we're going to get into some of these small group questions, but first, do you guys have some good stories about some predictions you've made or anything like that?
Yeah. You had a prediction. You said you.
I think you have the best story.
The best story?
Go ahead.
Okay.
What's your prediction?
Well, at CIY one summer, we were playing, there's a sand volleyball tournament. And so we had a team with some boys from our youth group, and we won. And so when you win the CIY volleyball tournament, you get interviewed on the screen.
Very prestigious.
Yeah. You get a sick pair of shades that are in my room somewhere, and then you get interviewed on the screen before the session or whatever that evening. And
you're probably on the stage, and then you're projected on the screen.
No.
So we're hovering on the screen.
No, we're hovering on the screen.
All right.
Because we're sitting outside and they're recording us.
Oh, okay.
Into the room.
Oh, okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, they are asking us goofy questions or whatever about volleyball, and we're like, yeah, worked really hard, trained at this a lot, whatever,
Right.
all the things. And so anyways, but they get to the end and they're just like, is there anything else that anybody wants to say? And so I said, Patrick Mahomes will win the MVP this season. This is before the first year that he played, that season when he won the MVP award. And so I just was like, being goofy, said Patrick Mahomes will win the MVP award with no idea of whether this guy would be good at football or not. And then he did win the MVP, so that was pretty cool. And all of Tennessee CIY that week knew all about it. So
All of Tennessee CIY 2.
Yeah, whatever that was.
High schoolers.
Yeah,
They knew.
they knew that I said that.
They heard your prediction.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. I don't make many predictions.
Yeah.
Sometimes people ask me things like sometimes people will ask me is Klayton dating anyone, and on occasion you have been,
Right.
and so on those occasions I'll say, well, yeah, there's this young lady he's sweet on.
Yeah.
Because I like that. I say sweet on.
Yeah, is that what you say?
Yeah, I say that a lot. And they'll say, oh, really? And they might say, do you think this is the one? And every time I say, no.
That's
No.
fair prediction.
And I've been right
part of
so
one of
far.
those. Yeah,
I've been right so far.
That was like staff meeting talk for a while.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
a lot of there's a lot of Klayton and Lacey dating talk. Elliot.
Oh,
We get some of that.
it's exciting
Not
stuff.
Elsie yet.
No.
It's too early.
Yes.
But it's coming for you, bro.
We got some years ahead of us.
All right.
We're not worried about that yet.
All right. So no, I don't make many predictions. Craig, you ever make a prediction?
Yeah, I guess I'm not one to make predictions, really. I don't know. I was trying to think of something while you guys were talking, but honestly, maybe I just stay away from it, so then I don't have to ever say I'm wrong.
There you go. Yeah.
That's my strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have a prediction for when you will allow Elsie to date?
Oh gosh.
You haven't thought about it.
Haven't thought about
Still
it.
on.
Maybe after this conversation, I'll begin to.
Yeah, contemplate that.
We'll bring that up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know pressure. All right.
Yeah. But we started this sermon series on Revelation on Sunday.
We did great segue.
Yeah.
Good
Thanks.
job. Yeah,
Thanks.
it was awesome.
Right. Well, John
Jump right in.
makes some predictions in here.
He does.
There you go.
About what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. God tells him what's gonna happen, and
Right.
in the first couple of verses here, we get these timing statements about when these things are going to happen or
Right.
whatever, and so how do we kind of make sense of these? It's 2,000 years later, and he's talking about the time being near and things soon taking place. And that was 2,000 years ago. So what do we make of that?
Right. Yeah, it's hard
Yeah,
because it's 2,000 years later.
it's true.
Yeah. What do you think, Craig?
So I got curious about those and consulted some commentaries and looked at the Greek words that are used right there, especially the one at the end of verse 3, where he says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. Blessed are the ones who hear and who keep what is written," and then he ends it with, "For the time is near." And I think it's easy to read that, and we get into the conversations of what that exactly means by near. But something that I read that I found really interesting was there's different Greek words that can be used to talk about time. And so in this verse, John didn't use chronos, which would talk about days or weeks or hours or whatever. He's not talking about a literal passing of time, but it's kairos, which is more so about reacting to the message. So I think that's really interesting because he puts it at the end of this statement, "Blessed are the ones who hear it, who read it, and who keep what is written." So then putting that in there, it's an opportunity to really respond to the message that he's going to give us in Revelation. I think it's put in the beginning of Revelation for a purpose. And it's funny because when I was in college, one of the guys that mentored me, the campus ministry was all about, they talked about kairos moments in life, and I didn't really think much of that word, but we talked about, he would talk about in the moment where you repent, you make a change, and then it's that progression of sanctification. And so when I read that, I was like, oh, this light bulb moment of like, it's an opportunity for people to read this message of Revelation, to repent and turn to Jesus and keep continuing to strive after him.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And Jesus talked about, there's lots of parallels between the book of Revelation, John's vision, and how he talks about that in Revelation, and Jesus teaching on similar topics in Matthew chapter 24. And it's towards the end of chapter 24 when Jesus describes, with the same kind of terminology, that these things are near, and he said it's like the time of Noah. And so you get that look back at Noah building the ark, and the flood is on its way, but the flood doesn't happen right away because there's got to be this time when Noah builds an ark. And so at least some people say that, I think it's Genesis 6:3, I'm not sure, but where it talks about man's time will be 120 years. And so some people say, well, that's, then God said people aren't going to live as long as they had been, except Noah lives for like
That's a while.
600 years or whatever. I mean, a long time. And there are people after Noah that live for much longer than they even do today. And so, 120 years, maybe that's the length of a person's lifetime. But there's lots of people who say, okay, well, this is approximately how long it took to build the ark. That there's 120 years between, when God said, okay, we're done. I'm not putting up with it anymore. There's going to be this end. And then there's this fairly lengthy period of time until this happens. And so, a couple things to keep in mind is that, Jesus describes it as this fairly lengthy period of time, right? This where people are looking at Noah and saying, what are you doing? I mean, can you imagine the reaction of somebody building a ship on dry ground, saying it's coming, the the port is going to be right here, and how people had to react to that. And I suppose that you might get similar kinds of reactions, when we talk about Jesus coming again, and just the way we frame that and think about it. Sometimes it's like, well, that's. Sure, there's a flood coming. No, sure, that's going to happen. And so I think a little bit of that there can be, even Jesus' language is kind of putting it at a far off kind of place, and where, of course, Peter talks about scoffers in the end days, and that same kind of attitude towards that. Yeah. So, kind of interesting to think about in those terms. And I guess the last thing I would say about it today, we're going to talk more about this all through our study of Revelation, and even next Sunday we'll talk about Jesus' second coming again, and the timing statement there, and one of the letters to the churches. And so we'll talk a little bit more about it. But I guess the last thing I would say today about this is that the last days is talked about in the Gospels and in the New Testament an awful lot. And it's always a reference to the time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. And so Jesus ushers in the last days with his arrival here. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, starting with verse 1, says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people," Paul says. And I guess my main point here would be, consider that and how Paul addresses and talks about the last days. And he was talking about people in the first century, but is that description any different than people in the 21st century, right? We are living in the last days, for sure, and those last days were ushered in with the coming of Jesus. And so a good biblical definition, this isn't my definition, I learned it from a professor, Shane Woods at Ozark, just reading his stuff. He said a biblical definition of the last days is the time between Jesus' first advent and the second advent, first coming and the second coming. So.
Yeah, that's really good. And that fits into both of those timing statements really well. I read about the first one, it's like, when he says these things are going to take place soon, it's like a promise, almost.
Right. We want to read Revelation like it's a chronology.
Right.
Like you said, that it's going to lay out this plan for the last days, for the end times. The only problem with that is that the end of the world comes in Revelation like 8 different times. Yeah. Just over and over and over again, you get these horrendous events, these horrendous visions of just the end. It's got to be the end. This has to be the end of the world, and over and over and over. And so it's not, you can't map out in the book of Revelation. Right. People try to do this. That's part of that historic view we talked about on Sunday. They want to see how it applies to the first century, but then that historian applies everything else, typically leading up to their lifetime. That's when it ends, right? Yeah. And so they map it all out, and they put times and dates with the events in Revelation. And the only trouble with that is you get to the end multiple times. Right. And so how do you figure which end is really the end? Yeah. So it's definitely not a chronology. Yeah.
So if we keep reading a little bit, we get into verse 9, and John's talking about that he's on this island. It's called Patmos, and so we know that John was on Patmos at some point. And so why is John here, and what's he doing, and what does this kind of teach us about the revelation.
Well, it teaches us first that it's a time of persecution for those churches and believers that John was writing to, because John is being persecuted here, right? He's exiled to this island, locked away, sent away, leave us alone sort of thing. So, that's why he's there. He's there for preaching Jesus crucified and risen from the grave. So, yeah.
And I think when we, just like any other, the apostles, and they all got some sort of persecution or martyred for spreading the gospel.
Right.
And so whenever I read something like this, where John is exiled to an island, and I don't know what circumstances exactly that would be, but, we see Paul get put in jail all the time, and his followers and everything. But whenever I read things like that and then think about our modern day circumstances, it's really encouraging to me, but at the same time, it's also hard for me, because we can see John in the middle of being persecuted, for one thing, sharing the gospel, and then we just think about how easy it is for us to think about our circumstances and trials that we go through, and then we can get really down on ourselves or whatever life throws at us. And what I love about the picture of what John is doing, he's exiled to this island, begins to have this vision, and then in verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So he's continuing to worship in the middle of this persecution. And so I want to always be able to take those examples and apply them, because who knows what he was going through, but he made the decision to remain faithful, to continue to worship, to not let his circumstances get in the way and think, like, where's God in all this? What has he done to me? Turn his back. He just continues to push forward and strive after Jesus.
Right.
And so that's always a huge encouragement to me. And I love that that's placed in there at the beginning of the letter too.
It is an awesome picture of somebody who has just been faithful to Jesus, and John's not a young man at this point, and so he has to figure this is about it. Yeah. Right? I mean, this is about it for me. And he continues to worship him and turn to Jesus. And I know there's been people in my life, I'm sure there's been people in your guys' life that you've seen kind of at the end when you think, how come, how do they keep going with all that pain or hurt or disease or loss of relationships, and, just their family and their friends have passed away already. They've lost all these things, and they continue to focus and search out and to worship Jesus. And this is just another example of that, and John's doing that here. And so a real example of really what the point of Revelation is, that Jesus is the message, and that he's worth worshiping, and he's worth following, and no matter the circumstances surrounding you, no matter where you find yourself or what you find yourself dealing with, Jesus is the solution ultimately, and he is worth turning towards. So good lessons just from John worshiping on the island.
Yeah, and so, John is on this island, he's worshiping, and he gets this vision in the next few verses of Jesus. And in verse 17, it says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last.'" And so why do we think that John reacts this way and just falls flat on his face here in verse 17?
I think anytime we see an angel or a vision show up, it's a similar reaction. And I looked at the, because I thought of Daniel. That was my first thing. I thought of Daniel.
Sure.
Because that's part of our reading plan. So we went through that. And then in our summer reading plan, we're reading Ezekiel and Isaiah, and they also have similar instances. So I wanted to read those real quick. So Isaiah 6:5 isn't as much as the representation or like the physical act of falling down, but in Isaiah 6:5, when he sees the vision, the glory of the Lord, says, "Woe is me, for I am lost," and that's kind of it's a spiritual reaction. He's humbled and he says, "Woe is me." It's like, I can't stand before what I'm seeing right now. And then Ezekiel 1:28 says, "Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, and when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard the voice of one speaking." So same kind of pattern. And then Daniel is more similar to what we see in John's instance here. So in Daniel 10, verse 7, going to verse 10, it says, "I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sounds of his words, and I heard the sound of his words fall, and I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face on the ground. And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees." And that one's really interesting to me because when John sees the vision, he falls as if he were dead. And then, as the same in Daniel, so the right hand touches him,
Right.
and begins to comfort him and let him know that it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And then what's interesting too is in verse 16, when he's describing Jesus, we get this kind of picture, some imagery, but it says in his right hand he held the 7 stars. So we see that the power of and the glory of Jesus, but then with that same right hand is the one that comforted John when he falls forward and is humbled and feels like he can't stand before this vision that he's having. So seems like the right response. It's kind of like the pattern throughout the Bible is to fall forward and
it's almost
like an act of worship kind of thing.
Right. It's almost the only appropriate response, right? There's that old song now, I Can Only Imagine, right, where he talks about, the songwriter talks about, when I see Jesus, and how am I going to react? Am I going to fall on my knees? Am I going to give him a big hug? What's that going to look like? And I think from the accounts in Scripture that you related, and just the picture of Jesus, this is how we mess up Jesus sometimes. The Supreme Court came down with these decisions, and so we're living in a world, in a country where we're talking about the separation of church and state a lot. So a guy like Thomas Jefferson gets quoted, all the time. I read a tweet the other day about something Thomas Jefferson said, and basically Jefferson was just ending up with, look, Jesus said some nice things, but he's, the Bible, not really more than a collection of nice sayings that we ought to be kind to one another, and that's the gist of the quote. And that's we just completely miss Jesus with that, right? We live in a world that wants to say, okay, well, yeah, Jesus said, some good things, treat others the way you want to be treated, and we ought to love one another for sure, and maybe there's some moral things that Jesus taught that we ought to follow, but we miss the fact that Jesus is God. I mean, that's the description. That's why John falls down. The verses 12 through 16, that the whole, in the midst of the golden lampstands, the white hair, the face on fire, the bronze boots, right? Refined in fire. All of those things describe the glory of God. And when you come face to face with the glory of God, you hide, right? That's a fearful thing, and so it's almost the only appropriate response. And I love what you said about the same right hand. And the right hand, when you read that in Scripture and in Revelation, that's most of the time, if not all the time, talking about power and authority and rule. And so the spear is going to be in the right hand, all those things. And in that same right hand, says it's going to be all right, John. Comforts him. So that's awesome. Yeah.
So, Revelation chapter 1 this Sunday. Do you have any concluding thoughts that you just
To wrap it up,
To
sum it up?
Yeah.
We just want to summarize chapter 1 in 15 seconds or less.
Yeah.
Right. It's a good question. Yeah, I think the message of Revelation is Jesus, and we start to unpack that in Revelation 1. This coming Sunday, we're going to read those 7 letters to 7 churches, and I think there's an awful lot to learn about the circumstances that we find ourselves in, that those 7 churches found themselves in, and just the reality of searching and holding on to and living out the message of Jesus in a particular time and place is a challenging thing, but it's, I mean, how can you not? How can you ignore it when this Jesus is standing before you? The voice that was speaking to me, I saw 7 golden lampstands. In the midst of the lampstands, one like Son of Man, clothed with a long robe, with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs on his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. That's a vision, that's a person, that's a God that you ought to pay attention to. And so the message of Revelation is Jesus. The message of Revelation chapter 1 is for sure, look, John, you're the messenger, but Jesus is the message. John, you're a worshiper, and we ought to learn from that, but Jesus is the worshipped. And so that to me is the message of Revelation 1, Jesus. And that's really the message of Revelation, of the Bible. Done.
Yeah. There you go.
Yep. So, this Sunday at Wallula, 9 and 10:30,
Right.
we're gonna keep going in our study of Revelation, and then we'll be back next week with a podcast talking about Sunday's message. So we love you guys. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Yeah.